The train whistle pierced the Montana silence as 19-year-old Catherine Miller stepped onto the wooden platform, her entire life packed in a single trunk. 6 days of travel had brought her 2,000 miles from Boston's crowded tenements to this remote frontier town, all to marry a man she'd never met. But as Thomas Wilson approached her, his expression darkened. "You're too young," he declared, crushing her dreams with 4 simple words. Abandoned in a strange town with no money to return east, Catherine faced the cruelest moment of her young life until a weathered hand extended toward her, belonging to James Parker, the retired sheriff, whose unexpected offer of guardianship would change everything. Neither could have imagined how their practical arrangement would transform into something neither was looking for, a family forged not from obligation, but from choice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Boston, 1892. The cotton mill's deafening clatter invaded Catherine Miller's dreams long after her 12-hour shift ended. Even now, standing at her tenement window, watching darkness settle over the city, she could feel the vibrations in her bones, as though the machines had permanently altered something. Inside her, 5 years at Blackwell Textiles had stolen the softness from her hands and the hope from her eyes. At 19, she already recognized the slow death that awaited. Decades more at the looms until consumption or exhaustion claimed her, just as they had taken her mother only 2 winters past. Catherine pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching ladies in fine carriages navigate the cobblestone streets below. Their lives seemed to exist in an entirely different world from hers, one of comfort and possibility rather than mere survival. "Miss Miller," her landlady's voice came sharp through the thin door. "Rent's due tomorrow, don't forget." "Yes, Mrs. Fletcher, I have it ready," Catherine replied, though the lie tasted bitter. She was $3 short, her meager savings depleted by medicine for the cough that had plagued her since January. When Mrs. Fletcher's footsteps faded, Catherine moved to her bed, a narrow cot with a thin mattress, and knelt beside it. From beneath, she withdrew a small tin box, once bright with painted flowers, now dulled by years of handling. Inside lay her entire fortune, $4.73. Not enough. The city beyond her window had once seemed full of promise. Her father had brought them here after the farm failed, convinced that Boston's burgeoning industries would provide the fresh start they needed. Then pneumonia took him during their first winter, leaving 16-year-old Catherine and her ailing mother to fend for themselves. Now, 3 years after burying her mother, Catherine found herself utterly alone. No family, no prospects, nothing but the relentless rhythm of the looms and the slow erosion of whatever future she might have claimed. Sleep eluded her that night, her mind circling through increasingly desperate options. She could beg Mrs. Fletcher for more time. She could seek additional hours at the mill, though her supervisors had already warned that her productivity was slipping. She could, the thought made her stomach clench, approach Mr. Davidson, the floor manager who had made his interest in helping young women workers abundantly clear. Morning arrived with weak sunlight filtering through dirty windows. Catherine, dressed mechanically in her faded blue work dress and threadbare shawl. Sunday was her only day of rest, the mill silent for 24 precious hours. Usually she spent it washing her clothes, mending tiers, and preparing the simple meals that would sustain her through the coming week. Today, however, she had a different purpose. Counting out 5 precious pennies from her box, she tucked them into her pocket and descended the narrow staircase that served the tenement's 5 floors. Outside, the air carried the perpetual blend of coal smoke, sewage, and humanity that defined Boston's working districts. The newspaper boy's familiar call rang out from the corner. "Herald! Sunday Herald! Tragedy at the docks! Herald!" Catherine approached him, extending her coins. "One paper, please." The boy, no more than 10, handed her the thick sheaf of newsprint with ink-stained fingers. "Terrible business at the docks yesterday, miss. 3 men drowned when the loading crane collapsed." But Catherine wasn't interested in the headlines or the tragedies that seemed to befall Boston with numbing regularity. Instead, as she made her way to the small park 3 blocks from her tenement, her attention was fixed on what the paper represented: possibility. Finding an unoccupied bench, a rarity on Sunday mornings, she settled onto the weathered wood and carefully opened the newspaper. The front page held no interest for her, nor did the political commentaries or reports of European affairs. With practiced movements, she turned directly to the back pages, to the section marked Personals and Matrimonials. Catherine had begun reading these advertisements 6 months ago, initially out of curiosity, then with increasing interest. Men from Western territories and newly established states seeking wives. Farmers, ranchers, merchants. Men who had land and prospects but lacked something essential: a woman to share their lives and help build their futures. Most notices were straightforward, even blunt. Successful miner seeks bride, must be hardy and of good character. Others attempted poetry. Gentleman of means, desires gentle companion to brighten prairie homestead. Loneliness is my only affliction. Catherine had never responded to any of them, though she'd composed countless letters in her mind. The idea seemed simultaneously desperate and daring, a gamble with her entire future at stake. What kind of woman entrusted herself to a stranger? Yet what kind of future awaited her in Boston? Today, her situation transformed these advertisements from idle fantasy to potential salvation. With rent due and her position at the mill increasingly precarious, Catherine allowed herself to truly consider what had previously been unthinkable. Her eyes moved methodically down the column until one advertisement drew her attention. Rancher in good standing seeks respectable young woman as wife. Must be of hearty constitution and willing to help manage household affairs. Located in promising community of Silver Creek, Montana Territory. Passage will be arranged. Inquire T. Wilson, General Delivery, Silver Creek. Unlike the others, this one conveyed a straightforward practicality that appealed to Catherine. No flowery promises, no excessive demands, just honest need, meeting honest offer. Silver Creek, Montana. She had no notion of where exactly it might be, only that it lay somewhere in the vast expanse west of the Mississippi, in territories she had studied briefly during her limited schooling. A place where land stretched wider than vision. A place where perhaps possibility still existed. Catherine carefully folded the newspaper, her decision crystallizing with unexpected clarity. She would write to T. Wilson of Silver Creek, not with desperate pleading or false pretenses, but with honesty. She had nothing to offer but her willingness to work, to learn, to build something alongside a stranger who might, in time, become something more. Back in her room, Catherine retrieved her single sheet of decent stationery, saved from a Christmas package her mother had received years earlier, and her carefully maintained pen. The letter took shape slowly, each word considered and reconsidered. Before being committed to paper, "Mr. Wilson, I'm writing in response to your advertisement in the Boston Herald dated April 17th, 1892. My name is Catherine Miller. I'm 19 years old, in good health, and currently employed at Blackwell Textiles in Boston. I have no family remaining and seek an opportunity for an honest life beyond what the city can offer. I was raised on a small farm in western Massachusetts until age 16, so while factory work has been my recent occupation, I am familiar with the demands of rural life. I can cook, sew, and manage household affairs. I am not afraid of hard work. I have no fortune or dowry to bring, only my willingness to be a loyal and supportive wife. If you require references regarding my character, Mrs. Sarah Winters, my former Sunday school teacher, would provide one. Should you wish to correspond further, you may write to me at the address below. If your mind is already settled elsewhere, I wish you good fortune in your search. Respectfully, Catherine Miller. She read the letter 3 times, searching for errors or improprieties before carefully folding it and placing it in her only envelope. After addressing it with details copied precisely from the advertisement, she sealed it with a drop of candle wax pressed flat. The following morning, before reporting to the mill, Catherine stopped at the post office and spent 2 more precious cents to send her letter westward. As the clerk tossed it casually into the outgoing mail basket, she experienced a momentary panic. What had she done? What desperate foolishness had compelled her to offer herself to a complete stranger in a place she couldn't even find on a map? Yet beneath the fear lay something else, a flicker of hope that had been absent for so long she barely recognized it. Whatever awaited in Silver Creek, Montana, it represented something Boston could no longer offer: the possibility of change. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 agonizing weeks passed before a response arrived. Catherine recognized it immediately by the unfamiliar handwriting and the Montana postmark. Her hands trembled so violently that she waited until safely inside her room before breaking the seal. The letter was written in a firm, slanted hand on quality paper. Miss Miller, your letter received and considered. Appreciate your straightforward manner. Silver Creek is a growing settlement with 27 families, church, school, and general store. My ranch lies 4 miles out, 120 acres, with 50 head of cattle. House is modest but sound, 2 bedrooms, built 5 years ago. I am 42, widowed 3 years this October. No children from previous marriage. Have been in Montana Territory, 9 years, originally from Pennsylvania. Served briefly in state militia after the war. No significant illnesses or debt. If you remain interested, enclosed find bank draft for train passage from Boston to Silver Creek. Journey takes approximately 6 days. Telegraph arrival date if you decide to come. Respectfully, Thomas Wilson. Enclosed was a bank draft for $75, more money than Catherine earned in 2 months at the mill. She sat heavily on her bed, the letter clutched in her hands. The brevity and practicality of his response somehow reassured her more than flowery promises might have. Thomas Wilson seemed a direct man, honest about his circumstances and expectations. Over the next week, 3 more letters passed between them. Catherine asking practical questions about what she should bring and what life in Silver Creek entailed. Thomas providing equally practical answers. Nothing in their correspondence suggested romance or passion, but Catherine didn't expect that. What she sought was partnership, security, purpose, things far more substantial than the fleeting emotions depicted in penny novels. Mrs. Fletcher received the news of Catherine's departure with thinly veiled suspicion. Mail order bride, are you? Well, wouldn't have expected it from a quiet thing like you. Better hope this rancher is who he claims. Many girls have gone west, never to be heard from again. Catherine weathered the landlady's dire predictions and the shocked whispers of her few acquaintances at the mill. Their concern, while perhaps genuine, came too late. Her decision was made, her meager possessions already packed in her mother's old trunk. On her final evening in Boston, Catherine visited the small church cemetery where her parents lay buried side by side. The April air carried a surprising warmth, hinting at the spring that would soon transform even this neglected corner of the city. I'm leaving tomorrow, she told the simple stone markers, going west to Montana. The words felt strange on her tongue, almost foreign. I don't know if it's the right choice, but it's the only one I can see. A robin landed on her father's headstone, regarding her with bright, unblinking eyes. I think you would understand, Papa. You always said sometimes a person has to make their own chances. She placed the wildflowers she'd gathered on both graves. "I'll carry you both with me, wherever I go." Dawn found Catherine already awake, dressed in her best blue traveling dress, her hair neatly arranged beneath a modest hat. The trunk, containing everything she owned in the world, waited by the door. Clothes, a few books, her mother's wedding ring, and the small tin box now containing only a final memento, a faded photograph of her parents taken on their wedding day. Outside, a hired carriage waited to take her to the station. The driver looked askance at her solitary trunk. "That all you got, miss?" "It's enough," Catherine replied, surprised at the steadiness in her voice. The Boston station bustled with early morning activity, businessmen with polished shoes and leather portfolios, families seeing off relatives, porters navigating carts piled high with luggage. Catherine felt conspicuously alone amid the chaos. A single woman embarking on a journey most would consider reckless at best, scandalous at worst. When the conductor called for boarding, she squared her shoulders and stepped onto the train that would carry her west. The first leg would take her to Chicago, where she would change to the transcontinental line. As the train pulled away from the platform, Catherine caught a final glimpse of Boston's skyline, silhouetted against the rising sun, the city that had been her home, her prison, and ultimately her point of departure. She felt no sentimentality, no regret, only the curious lightness that comes with absolute commitment to a course of action. "First time heading west?" The question came from an elderly woman seated across from her, hands busy with knitting, needles that clicked rhythmically against one another. "Yes, ma'am." The woman's eyes crinkled with something between amusement and concern. "Visiting family?" Catherine hesitated only briefly. "Getting married, actually." "Ah." The woman nodded knowingly. "One of those arrangements. Well, don't look so alarmed, dear. My own granddaughter went to Oregon as a mail-order bride last year. Writes that she's quite content." The knitting needles never paused. "It's no easy life out there, mind you, but then what life is?" As countryside replaced city views outside the window, Catherine reflected on the woman's words. No easy life, that much she expected, but perhaps it would be a life with purpose, with possibility, a life of her own choosing rather than one dictated by circumstance. The train journey unfolded like a dream, hours of monotonous rhythm punctuated by brief stops in towns whose names blurred together in Catherine's memory. Chicago appeared as a shock of noise and activity after 2 days of rural landscapes. The station dwarfed Boston's, smoke-filled and echoing with announcements, shouts, and the constant percussion of footsteps on marble floors. With 4 hours between connections, Catherine found herself adrift in a foreign world. She clutched her small handbag containing Thomas's letters, her ticket, and the remaining money from his draft. Following a porter's directions, she located a ladies' waiting room where she could rest relatively undisturbed. "Heading far?" asked the matron who supervised the room, her stern countenance softened by eyes that had witnessed thousands of journeys begin and end. "Montana Territory." The matron's eyebrows rose slightly. "Alone?" "Yes." "Family there?" Again, Catherine hesitated before answering. "My fiancé." To her surprise, the matron smiled. "Well then, congratulations are in order. You'll want to freshen up before continuing west. Washrooms are through. At that door, I can watch your trunk." Gratitude washed over Catherine. This small kindness from a stranger somehow validated her journey, made it seem less reckless and more like a path others had traveled before her. When she boarded the westbound train that would carry her across the Mississippi and into territories she had only read about in newspaper accounts, Catherine found herself seated beside a young mother traveling with twin boys of about 4 years. The woman looked exhausted, dark circles beneath her eyes suggesting sleepless nights spent managing her energetic sons. "Rebecca Carter," she introduced herself as the train lurched into motion. And these little terrors are Samuel and Stuart. We're meeting my husband in Cheyenne. He's with the railroad. Catherine Miller. I'm traveling to Silver Creek, Montana. Rebecca's expression brightened. Montana! How wonderful! I've heard it's beautiful country, though my James writes that the winters are fierce. She lowered her voice. Are you traveling to family? The former sheriff's eyes held hers for a long moment, seeing more than she wished to reveal. James Parker, he offered with a slight nod. Welcome to Silver Creek. His attention returned to Thomas Wilson. Now, what seems to be the trouble? Here. Wilson shifted uncomfortably. Miss Miller responded to my advertisement for a wife. There was a misunderstanding about certain particulars. I see. James Parker's expression revealed nothing, though something in his tone suggested he understood perfectly well. And now Mr. Wilson has determined I'm unsuitable, Catherine said, unable to keep a slight tremor from her voice. Too young in appearance, if not in actual years. Parker's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes flickered briefly with something, disapproval perhaps, though whether directed at her or Wilson remained unclear. The boarding house is full up this week, he said, after a moment's consideration. Railroad crews in town for the bridge repair. He turned to Catherine. Miss Miller, my home has a spare room that my late wife kept ready for visitors. It's yours until more permanent arrangements can be made. Catherine hesitated. In Boston, accepting such an offer from a strange man would be unthinkable. Yet Boston's rules seemed impossibly distant now, and her alternatives appeared non-existent. That's very generous, but I wouldn't want to impose, she managed. Not an imposition, Parker replied simply, and it's proper enough. I'm old enough to be your grandfather, and my reputation in this town was established long before you were born. He turned to Wilson. You'll see to her trunk being delivered? Relief washed over Thomas Wilson's face. Of course. Right away. Good. Parker nodded once, decisive. My wagon's just there, Miss Miller, when you're ready. Moments later, Catherine found herself seated beside James Parker in a well-maintained wagon, her small handbag clutched tightly in her lap as they pulled away from the station. Her mind spun with the rapid reversal of her circumstances, from bride-to-be to charity case in the space of 5 minutes. I'm sorry about Wilson, Parker said as they turned onto Silver Creek's main street. He's not a bad man, just concerned with appearances. Too concerned, if you ask me, but no one does these days. A hint of wry humor colored his tone. Catherine didn't trust herself to respond. The storefronts of Silver Creek blurred through. Unshed tears, a general store, a small church, what appeared to be a saloon. People turned to watch the wagon pass, curious about the young woman beside their former sheriff. Small towns run on talk, Parker continued, seemingly untroubled by her silence. Best thing is to give them something honest to talk about. You'll be under my protection as a guardian, nothing more. My Mary was well respected here before she passed. Her good name will shield you from the worst gossip. Guardian, the word, struck Catherine with unexpected force. At 19, she had considered herself long past needing guardianship, yet here she was, utterly dependent on a stranger's kindness in a town where she knew no one and had no standing. Why are you helping me? She finally asked as they left the main street behind, the wagon now following a well-worn path that wound gently upward. Parker considered her question with the seriousness it deserved. Could say it's because it's the right thing. Could say it's what Mary would have expected of me. He adjusted the reins slightly. Truth is, when you get to my age, you recognize trouble that's not of someone's own making. What's happening to you isn't fair, and I've spent most of my life dealing with unfairness one way or another. They crested a small rise, and Parker's home came into view. A modest but well-constructed house of weathered timber with a wide, porch wrapping around two sides. A large oak tree provided shade near a small barn and corral. Beyond stretched grasslands that eventually gave way to pine-covered foothills, and beyond those, mountains that seemed to hold up the sky itself. It's not much, Parker said, as he brought the wagon to a stop, but it's solid. Mary always said the view made up for what the house lacked in grandeur. Catherine had to agree. After Boston's crowded tenements, where one building pressed against the next, the openness here seemed almost overwhelming, as if the sky had expanded to dimensions she hadn't known possible. Parker helped her down from the wagon with old-fashioned courtesy. "Spare rooms through there," he explained once they were inside, gesturing to a door off the main living area. "Was meant to be a nursery, but that wasn't in God's plan for us." Mary kept it ready anyway for visitors or those in need. The house's interior was neat, but decidedly masculine, bearing the hallmarks of a space where a woman's touch had once been present, but was now maintained by a man's more practical standards. Furniture was arranged for function rather than appearance, and while nothing was dirty, there was a spareness to the decoration that spoke of absence. The room he indicated was small, but pleasant, containing a narrow bed with a handmade quilt, a chest of drawers, and a small writing desk positioned beneath a window that overlooked the mountains. A vase of dried wildflowers sat atop the chest, an unexpectedly gentle touch in this bachelor household. "Bathrooms out back," Parker explained. "I'll give you privacy to settle in. Kitchen's stocked if you're hungry. Make yourself at home." With that, he retreated, his boots making solid sounds against the wooden floor. Alone for the first time. Since her arrival, Catherine sank onto the edge of the bed, the events of the day finally overwhelming her composure. Tears came then, silent but insistent, for dreams abandoned, for humiliation endured, for the terrifying uncertainty of her future. What would become of her now, stranded in this remote place, with no prospects and dwindling resources? How could she have been so foolish as to stake everything on the words of a stranger? She didn't know how long she sat there, tears gradually subsiding into a hollow emptiness, before a knock at the house's front door roused her. Quickly wiping her face, she listened as James Parker's footsteps crossed to answer it. A man's voice, Thomas Wilson's, spoke briefly, followed by the sound of something heavy being set down. "Much obliged," Parker's voice came clearly. "Good evening to you." The door closed, and after a moment, a soft knock came at Catherine's room. "Miss Miller, your trunk's here if you'd like to unpack." Catherine opened the door to find Parker standing respectfully at a distance, gesturing toward where her trunk now sat in the main room. "Thank you," she managed. He nodded, studying her face briefly. If he noticed evidence of her tears, he made no mention of it. "I was about to make coffee. Would you care for some?" The simple, normal question somehow steadied her. "Yes. Thank you. And please call me Catherine." A hint of a smile touched his weathered face. "Catherine, then. And I'm James to most folks these days, now that Sheriff isn't attached to my name anymore." In the kitchen, a practical space with a cast-iron stove, sturdy wooden table, and open shelving, James moved with the efficient motions of a man accustomed to tending his own needs. There was nothing elegant about his coffee-making process, but there was competence, and soon the rich aroma filled the small space. "Sugar?" he offered, setting a sturdy mug before her. When she nodded, he pushed a small bowl in her direction. "Milk's in the cold box, if you want it." Catherine doctored her coffee, grateful for the mundane activity. The hot liquid warmed her from inside, chasing away some of the chill that had settled in her chest since Wilson's rejection. "Thank you," she said again, the words encompassing more than just the coffee. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't intervened." James settled across from her, his own mug cupped between, hands that bore the marks of physical labor and years. "Wilson would have found you a place eventually. He's not a cruel man, just narrow in his thinking." He sipped his coffee before continuing. So, Boston to Silver Creek is a long journey for a woman alone. You must have had compelling reasons. It wasn't quite a question, but Catherine recognized it as an opening, an opportunity to explain herself if she wished. Strangely, she found she did wish to. Something about James Parker's direct manner invited honesty. "My parents died several years ago," she began, tracing the rim of her mug with one finger. "I've been working at a textile mill in Boston since I was 16. It's not a life that offers much future." She met his eyes briefly. Mr. Wilson's advertisement seemed to offer a chance at something better, or at least different. James nodded, accepting her explanation without judgment. "Most folks come west looking for something. Opportunity, second chances, space to breathe. Nothing wrong with that." He studied her over the rim of his mug. "What will you do now?" The question she'd been avoiding since the moment of Wilson's rejection. "I don't know," she admitted. "I have some money left from what Mr. Wilson sent for my travel, perhaps enough to return east, though I'm not sure what awaits me there either." The prospect of returning to Boston in defeat made her stomach clench. "No need to decide tonight," James said, rising to place his empty mug in the basin. "You're welcome here while you consider your options. Silver Creek's small, but there's usually work to be found. General store might need help, or the school if you've got any education." "I can read and write well enough," Catherine replied, "and I'm not afraid of hard work." "Good, because life out here is nothing but work, but it's honest work. Builds something worthwhile." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Get some rest. Things often look clearer in the morning." Alone again, Catherine found her exhaustion finally overtaking anxiety. After unpacking only what she needed for the night, she readied herself for bed, the day's events still tumbling through her mind. As she slipped beneath the quilt, a strange thought occurred to her. For all the shock and humiliation of Wilson's rejection, she felt no personal loss. She had prepared herself to marry a stranger for practical reasons, but now that the arrangement had collapsed, she realized she felt more relief than disappointment regarding Wilson himself. Sleep came like a sudden storm, deep and consuming. Morning arrived with unfamiliar sounds, roosters announcing dawn, the distant lowing of cattle, birds whose songs she couldn't identify. For a disorienting moment, Catherine couldn't remember where she was. Then reality rushed back. Silver Creek, James Parker's house, her uncertain future. She dressed quickly in one of her simpler dresses, arranged her hair neatly, and ventured into the main part of the house. To her surprise, James was already gone, though evidence of his morning activities remained: coffee in the pot, a plate with crumbs on the table, a note propped against the sugar bowl. Gone to help Martin with fence repairs. Back by noon. Make yourself at home. J.P. The simple domestic moment, waking in a quiet house to find evidence of another's routine, struck Catherine with unexpected force. In Boston, her tenement had been constantly filled with noise. Other residents, arguing, children crying, the perpetual clatter of the street below. This quiet, this space, seemed almost decadent by comparison. After a simple breakfast of bread and coffee, Catherine found herself drawn to the porch, where a wooden chair offered a view across the grasslands to the mountains beyond. The morning air carried scents she couldn't name. Pine, sage, something. Wild and clean, that had no counterpart in Boston's industrial odors. A movement caught her attention, a deer and her fawn picking their way cautiously across a distant meadow. Catherine watched, barely breathing, until they disappeared into a stand of trees. Such a small thing, yet it filled her with a peculiar lightness. The sound of wagon wheels eventually drew her attention back to the present. A woman, perhaps 10 years older than Catherine, approached in a small buggy drawn by a dappled mare. She brought the vehicle to a stop and regarded Catherine with open curiosity. "You must be Miss Miller," she called, gathering her skirts to descend. "I'm Hannah Green from the general store. James stopped by early this morning and mentioned you might be looking for work." Surprised by this development, Catherine rose to greet her visitor. "Yes, I'm Catherine Miller. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Green." "Miss Green," the woman corrected with a smile. "Never found a man worth giving up my independence for." She ascended the steps, extending a hand that was strong and calloused from work. "James said you arrived yesterday. From Boston, is it?" "Yes." Catherine wasn't sure how much else the former sheriff had shared about her circumstances. Hannah Green seemed to sense her uncertainty. "Small towns," she said with a shrug. "News travels fast, especially when it involves Thomas Wilson finally. Finding someone to respond to that advertisement he's been running for months." Heat rose in Catherine's cheeks. "I'm afraid it didn't work out as planned." "So I gathered." Hannah's direct gaze held no pity, only practical assessment. "Well, his loss may be my gain. I need help at the store 3 days a week. Inventory. Serving customers, keeping the books straight. Pay's not extravagant, but it's fair. Would that interest you?" The unexpected offer momentarily stunned Catherine. "Yes," she managed. "Very much so." "Good. Can you start tomorrow, 9 o'clock? Just like that, a door that had seemed firmly closed only yesterday now stood slightly ajar, offering a glimpse of possibility. "I'll be there," Catherine promised. Anna nodded, satisfied. The store's easy enough to find. Largest building on Main Street. Can't miss it. By now, Catherine had her answer prepared. "To my fiancé. He's a rancher near Silver Creek." "How romantic!" Rebecca exclaimed, then immediately tempered her reaction. "Forgive me, I don't mean to pry. There's nothing to forgive." Catherine surprised herself with a small smile. "Though I wouldn't call it romantic, exactly. Practical, more like." Rebecca nodded, understanding. "Sometimes practical arrangements make the strongest foundations. James and I had a proper courtship, his mother hovering over every conversation. 2 years of stifled talks about the weather before he finally proposed. Now we communicate better by letter than we ever did in person." She laughed, then turned. "Serious. The important thing is respect. With that, affection often follows. De to deal." As the landscape outside transformed from the neat farms of the Midwest to the sprawling prairies beyond the Mississippi, Catherine found unexpected comfort in Rebecca's company. The young mother shared stories of her own adjustment to married life, offered practical advice about household management, and even insisted on sharing her packed lunch when Catherine admitted she hadn't thought to bring provisions. "The dining car is dreadfully expensive," Rebecca explained, passing Catherine half a sandwich. "James would have my hide if he knew I spent money there when perfectly good food can be packed." For 3 days, they traveled together, watching America unfold outside their window, prairies giving way to distant mountains, settlements growing sparser, landscapes more dramatic. The twins, initially wary of Catherine, eventually adopted her as an honorary aunt, demanding stories and games to pass the long hours. When Rebecca and her sons disembarked at Cheyenne, Catherine felt the loss keenly. "Write to me," Rebecca insisted, pressing a slip of paper with her address into Catherine's hand. "I want to hear how your rancher turns out." "I will," Catherine promised, surprised to find tears threatening. This brief friendship had somehow made her journey feel less solitary, less daunting. The final stretch to Silver Creek proved the most physically demanding. A smaller train on narrower gauge tracks that seemed to hit every bump in the mountainous terrain. Catherine shared her car with miners, cattle buyers, and a group of Norwegian immigrants whose language she couldn't understand, but whose apprehension she recognized in their wide-eyed stares at the passing wilderness. On the sixth day, as afternoon, sunshine slanted through dust-streaked windows. The conductor moved through the car, calling out, Silver Creek Station approaching!" Catherine gathered her reticule with trembling hands. This was it, the moment when abstract plans would collide with concrete reality. Somewhere on that approaching platform, Thomas Wilson would be waiting. The man whose practical letters had offered her escape from Boston would have a face, a voice, a presence. As the train hissed to a stop, Catherine caught her first glimpse of Silver Creek through the window, a modest collection of wooden buildings strung along a wide dirt street, mountains rising dramatically in the distance. The platform held perhaps a dozen people waiting for arriving passengers or cargo. Drawing a deep breath, Catherine smoothed her travel-rumpled skirt and adjusted her hat. She had done everything possible to present herself well, even using precious water from the trains. Washroom to freshen her face before arrival. "Miss, your trunk?" The porter stood in the aisle, waiting. "Yes, thank you." She followed him onto the platform, squinting in the bright Montana sunshine that seemed somehow more intense than the light she had known in Boston. People moved around her, reunions happening, packages claimed, business conducted. Catherine stood beside her trunk, scanning faces for one that might belong to Thomas Wilson. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain others must hear it. Then a tall figure approached, a man perhaps in his early 40s, with graying temples and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore practical clothes, not fancy but well-maintained, and a wide-brimmed hat that he removed as he neared her. "Miss Miller?" His voice matched his letters, direct, unembellished. Catherine nodded, extending her hand. "Mr. Wilson." He took her hand briefly, his grip firm but not painful. His eyes, however, registered something Catherine hadn't anticipated. Surprise followed by what appeared to be disappointment. "You're younger than I expected," he said finally, releasing her hand and taking a step back. His gaze swept over her from head to toe, assessing rather than admiring. "I mentioned my age in my letters," Catherine replied, struggling to keep her voice even. "I'm 19. Thomas Wilson frowned, creating deep lines in a face weathered by sun and wind. Must have overlooked that detail. He cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Miss Miller, I don't mean to cause offense, but you appear even younger than your stated age." Catherine felt heat rising in her cheeks, not from flattery, but from growing apprehension. "I assure you, Mr. Wilson, I am 19 years old and fully capable." He raised a hand, cutting off her words. "It's not a question of capability, it's a matter of..." He struggled, clearly uncomfortable. "Of appearances. Silver Creek is a small community. People talk. A man my age with a bride who looks barely more than a child. It wouldn't be proper." The ground seemed to shift beneath Catherine's feet as understanding dawned. 6 days of travel. Her entire savings spent. Every bridge behind her burned. And now, rejection. "Sir," she began, fighting to maintain composure, "I have come a very long way based on our correspondence. If there was some misunderstanding..." "The misunderstanding was mine," he interrupted, not unkindly but firmly. "I should have been more specific in my requirements. This is an unfortunate situation, Miss Miller, but surely you can see it wouldn't be appropriate." Around them, the platform had nearly emptied, the train preparing for its departure further, west. Catherine became acutely aware of curious glances from the few remaining bystanders, witnesses to her humiliation. Thomas Wilson shifted his weight uncomfortably. "I cannot in good conscience leave you stranded, however. The eastbound train won't return for 3 days. I'll arrange accommodation at the boarding house and provide funds for your return journey." The charity in his offer only deepened Catherine's mortification. To be rejected, then pitied. To travel so far only to be sent back like an unsuitable package. Tears threatened, but she forced them down, unwilling to add public weeping to her disgrace. "That won't be necessary, Mr. Wilson," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm certain I can manage. Is there a problem here, Thomas?" A new voice entered the conversation, deep, authoritative, but not unkind. Catherine turned to find an older man regarding them with keen interest. Tall despite his years, with silver hair and a weathered face that suggested decades under Montana skies, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to respect. "Sheriff Parker," Thomas acknowledged, removing his hat again. "Just a misunderstanding about an arrangement. Former sheriff," the older man corrected mildly, "retired last spring, as you well know." His gaze shifted to Catherine, assessing but not judgmental. "And who might this young lady be?" "Catherine Miller, sir," she answered, summoning what dignity remained. "From Boston. Wear something practical. Some days get busy." She turned to go, then paused. "Oh, and don't mind the gossips. They'll talk for a week or two, then find someone else to fuss over. That's how it works around here." As quickly as she had arrived, Hannah Green departed, leaving Catherine to marvel at the abrupt change in her fortunes. A roof over her head, however temporary. Work that would provide income. Small things, perhaps, but they represented a foundation upon which something more might be built. When James returned at midday, she told him about Hannah's visit and offer. "Hannah's good people," he said approvingly. "Fair in her dealings doesn't suffer fools. You could do worse for an employer." He removed his hat, running a hand through silver hair, damp with honest work. "You've decided to stay in Silver Creek, then?" "For now," Catherine replied carefully. "At least until I can determine what comes next." James nodded, accepting her cautious approach. Wise. Never hurts to keep options open. He moved to wash. Up at the basin, town's having a social at the church tomorrow evening. Might be a good opportunity to meet folks under better circumstances than yesterday's. The thought of facing the community that had surely already heard of her arrival and rejection made Catherine's stomach tighten. "I'm not sure that's your choice," James interrupted gently. "But hiding only gives gossip more power. Show up, be polite. Let people see you're just a normal young woman trying to make her way. Takes the mystery out of it, and folks move on quicker." His practical approach to managing small-town dynamics made sense, yet the prospect remained daunting. "I'll consider it," she said finally. "That's all I ask." James dried his hands on a towel hung beside the basin. "Now, I'm no great cook, but I can manage a decent stew if you're hungry." The next morning, Catherine dressed with particular care for her first day at Green's General Store. Her wardrobe, limited to begin with, offered few options, but she selected her most practical skirt and shirtwaist, arranging her hair in a simple but neat style that she hoped conveyed capability rather than fashion. James offered to drive her into town, but Catherine chose to walk, needing the time and space to gather her thoughts. The dirt road leading from James's property into Silver Creek proper offered views that still startled her with their vastness. Rolling grasslands giving way to forested foothills, all beneath a sky so wide and blue it seemed almost fictional. After Boston's smoke-filtered atmosphere, Silver Creek by daylight revealed itself as a settlement poised between frontier outpost and established town. The main street featured permanent structures, the general store, church, school, and a handful of businesses, while the outskirts still held the more temporary constructions of a community in transition. People moved with purpose rather than the frantic energy of Boston, nodding to Catherine as she passed, rather than averting their eyes as city dwellers did. Green's General Store occupied a prominent corner location, its wooden facade featuring large windows displaying everything from tools to fabric bolts to canned goods. A bell jingled cheerfully as Catherine entered, announcing her arrival to Hannah Green, who stood behind a long counter sorting mail. "Right on time," Hannah observed, approvingly, Good. First rule of business out here, reliability matters more than almost anything else. When people ride 2 hours for supplies, they need to know you'll be open when you say you will be. The store's interior held a bewildering array of merchandise. Practical necessities like flour, sugar, and coffee sharing space with tools. Clothing, medicines, and luxury items that must have traveled thousands of miles to reach this remote location. Every available surface had been utilized, with goods stacked to the ceiling and hanging from rafters. It's organized chaos, Hannah explained, noting Catherine's overwhelmed expression. Looks random, but there's a system. You'll learn it. She gestured Catherine behind the counter. Start by watching how I handle customers. By afternoon, you can try serving some yourself. Questions? What exactly are my duties? Catherine asked. Whatever needs doing, Hannah replied matter-of-factly. Serving customers, stocking shelves, unpacking deliveries, keeping inventory records. On mail days, sorting letters and packages. She pointed to a small desk in the corner. Bookkeeping happens there. I'll show you the system once you're comfortable with the rest. The morning passed in a blur of activity. Customers arrived steadily, ranchers needing supplies, townswomen selecting household goods, children sent for specific items with carefully counted coins clutched in small hands. Hannah knew every person by name, often inquiring about family members or ongoing projects with genuine interest. Catherine observed the many small courtesies that made up the fabric of community life here. Accounts maintained with nothing more than entries in a ledger, special orders remembered without written record, local news exchanged alongside commerce. It was commerce conducted on a human scale, where relationships mattered as much as transactions. By midday, Hannah had Catherine serving customers under her watchful eye, correcting mistakes gently but firmly. Mrs. Peterson prefers the blue thread, not the black. The Andersons' account has special terms. Mark it in the second ledger. When the Miller boys come in, count their change twice. They're tricksters. Despite the overwhelming amount of information, Catherine found herself enjoying the work. Unlike the mindless repetition of the textile mill, this required engagement, memory, and human connection. When Hannah finally announced it was time for a midday break, Catherine was surprised to discover 3 hours had passed. You're doing well, Hannah said as they shared a simple lunch of bread and cheese in the store's back room. Quick learner, good with people despite being shy. Thank you, Catherine replied, the praise warming her after months of being just another interchangeable factory worker. I'm trying. Hannah studied her thoughtfully. May I speak plainly? Of course. The town's talking about you, that's inevitable. Young woman arrives to marry Wilson, gets turned away, ends up under James Parker's roof. It's the most interesting thing to happen here since the miller's barn caught fire in March. Hannah's direct gaze held no judgment, only practicality. Most of it's just curiosity, not malice. Best way to handle it is to be visible but unremarkable. Do your work, be polite, attend church. Give them nothing to speculate about and they'll lose interest. Catherine nodded, recognizing the wisdom in this approach. Thank you for the advice and for the opportunity to work here. Don't thank me yet, Hannah replied with a hint of humor. Wait until you've survived a Saturday when the ranch hands come to town. She rose, signaling the end of their break. Now, let me show you how we unpack a merchandise shipment. The spring goods arrived yesterday, and they won't shelve themselves. The afternoon brought more customers, including several women who clearly came as much to assess the newcomer as to make purchases. Catherine met their barely concealed curiosity with quiet professionalism, answering direct questions politely, but volunteering no additional information about herself. By closing time, physical and mental exhaustion competed for dominance, Catherine's feet ached from standing, her mind reeled from attempting to memorize merchandise locations and prices, and her face felt stiff from maintaining a pleasant expression through countless interactions. "Leistung, Desi, you survived," Hannah observed as they completed the closing routine. "Same time, day after tomorrow. Thursdays are usually quieter than Tuesdays, so we can work more on inventory then." Outside, Catherine was surprised to find James Parker waiting beside his wagon. "Thought you might appreciate a ride home after your first day," he explained. "Walking loses its appeal when you've been on your feet all day." The simple thoughtfulness of this gesture touched Catherine unexpectedly. "Thank you. That's very kind." As they traveled the now familiar road back to his home, James asked about her day with genuine interest, nodding at her observations about the store and Hannah's methods. "Hannah built that business from nothing after her father died," he explained. "Most folks thought a woman couldn't manage it, especially one who refused to marry just to have a man's name attached to the enterprise. She proved them wrong within a year. She seems very capable," Catherine agreed. "And fair." James nodded. "Good judge of character, too. Doesn't offer employment to just anyone." He glanced sideways at Catherine. "Have you thought more about the social tonight?" The day's exertions had almost driven the church gathering from Catherine's mind. Now the prospect of facing even more of the community seemed daunting, yet Hannah's advice about visibility and normalcy made sense. "I'll go," she decided aloud, "though I have nothing particularly suitable to wear." "Folks here care more about who shows up than what they're wearing," James assured her. "Simple and clean is all that's expected." 3 hours later, having rested, changed into her best remaining dress, and arranged her hair as neatly as possible, Catherine found herself walking beside James toward the small white church that formed the social center of Silver Creek. Lanterns illuminated the path, while the sound of conversation and occasional laughter spilled from the open doors. "Ready?" James asked as they approached. Catherine took a deep breath, summoning her courage. "As I'll ever be." The church's modest sanctuary had been transformed for the occasion, pews pushed back to create open space where perhaps 30 people gathered in small conversational groups. A table along one wall held refreshments, coffee, lemonade, and an assortment of home-baked goods. Someone played hymns on a slightly out-of-tune piano, providing background to the sociable buzz. Their entrance did not go unnoticed. Conversations paused briefly as heads turned, curious eyes taking in Catherine's presence beside the former sheriff. Then, with the practiced politeness of small-town society, attention seemed to shift elsewhere, though Catherine had no doubt. They remained the primary topic of whispered exchanges. James guided her toward a group that included Hannah Green and several older women, whose expressions ranged from openly curious to carefully neutral. "Ladies," he greeted them. "May I introduce Miss Catherine Miller, recently arrived from Boston. Catherine, this is Mrs. Henderson, Mrs. Clark, and Mrs. Wilson." The last name caught Catherine by surprise. An older woman with silver-streaked dark hair and kind eyes extended her hand. "Thomas's mother," she explained, apparently reading. Catherine's expression, "Please don't be uncomfortable, dear. My son sometimes lacks imagination about unconventional situations. I'm glad to meet you properly." The simple kindness in this potentially awkward introduction eased some of Catherine's tension. "It's a pleasure to meet you all," she managed. Conversation flowed more easily than she had feared. The women asked about Boston, about her journey west, about her impressions of Silver Creek, all safe topics that allowed her to participate without revealing too much about her circumstances. If they were curious about her arrangement with James Parker, they kept such questions to themselves, at least in her presence. "You're staying with James, I understand," Mrs. Henderson commented, her tone carefully neutral despite the potential impropriety such an arrangement might suggest elsewhere. "Yes, temporarily," Catherine replied. "He's been very kind to offer guardianship while I establish myself here." She borrowed James's own phrasing deliberately, establishing the proper nature of their relationship. Mrs. Henderson nodded approvingly. James Parker's word has been good in this town for 30 years. If he says you're under his protection, that's good enough for most folks with sense. Most folks, Mrs. Wilson echoed with a significant glance toward a group of women across the room who were not bothering to hide their scrutiny of Catherine. Don't mind the Everett sisters, Hannah murmured as the conversation shifted to other topics. They've appointed themselves the moral guardians of Silver Creek, despite having the least claim to such authority. Catherine found herself smiling at Hannah's blunt assessment, grateful for allies in this unfamiliar social landscape. As the evening progressed, she was introduced to more townspeople, the schoolteacher, the blacksmith and his wife, several ranchers whose names blurred together. Most were politely welcoming, though she noted the careful distance maintained by some, particularly those with marriageable sons. James remained nearby without hovering, his calm presence providing an anchor in the swirling social currents. Watching him interact with his neighbors, Catherine observed the respect accorded to him, not from his former position of authority, but from something more fundamental, a reputation built on fairness and integrity. When they finally departed, the night air cool against her flushed cheeks, Catherine realized she had survived her first public appearance with surprising success. That wasn't as terrible as I feared, she admitted, as they walked home under a canopy of stars, more brilliant than any Boston night had ever displayed. James chuckled, the sound warm in the darkness. People here are mostly decent. They just need time to take your measure. He was quiet for a moment before adding, "You handled yourself well. Dignified without being standoffish. Makes a good impression." His simple approval offered unexpected comfort. They walked the remainder of the way in companionable silence, the distant howl of coyotes and the rhythmic chirp of insects creating a night symphony utterly foreign to Catherine's urban ears. The days that followed fell into an unexpectedly comfortable pattern. Catherine worked at Green's General Store 3 days a week, gradually mastering the systems and relationships that kept commerce flowing in this remote community. On her non-working days, she helped maintain James's household, finding satisfaction in bringing order to spaces long maintained by bachelor practicality rather than feminine attention to detail. James never demanded such assistance, but his quiet appreciation when she prepared proper meals or freshened long-neglected curtains told her the efforts were valued. They settled into a domestic routine that might have appeared strange to outsiders, but suited them both. Separate lives intersecting at meals and occasional evenings spent reading by the fire, each respecting the other's privacy and independence. Spring advanced across the Montana landscape, bringing wildflowers in riotous profusion across the grasslands and lengthening days that stretched golden toward summer. Catherine found herself noticing beauty in unexpected places, the perfect symmetry of a hawk circling overhead, the intricate patterns of frost on the water bucket, the way distant mountains changed color with the shifting light. One evening in late May, as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the western sky in shades of crimson and gold, James broke their comfortable silence. "You seem to be settling in here." Catherine considered his observation. 6 weeks had passed since her arrival. 6 weeks that had transformed her from desperate refugee to someone beginning to find her footing. I think, more than I expected to. Hannah says you're doing well at the store. Customers ask for you, specifically now. It's satisfying work, Catherine acknowledged. Different from the mill. There, I was just part of the machinery. Interchangeable. Here, she searched for the right words. Here, what I do matters to actual people I can see and know. James nodded, understanding. That's the difference between living in a community and just occupying space in a city. Something in his tone prompted Catherine to ask a question she'd been wondering about. Why did you stay? After Mrs. Parker passed, I mean. Many men might have sought a change. James was quiet for so long, she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of considered thought. Mary loved this place, saw beauty in it that took me years to recognize. After she was gone, I considered leaving. But then I realized every memory I had of her was here, in this house, this land. Leaving would have meant leaving part of her behind. He gazed toward the mountains, now deepening to purple as twilight. Advanced. Besides, a man my age starts to understand the value of belonging somewhere, of having history in a place. His words resonated with something Catherine had begun to feel herself, the steadying influence of connection to place and people. In Boston, she had existed but never belonged, always aware of her precarious position on society's margins. Here, despite her unconventional arrival, she was beginning to establish genuine connections. With Hannah, with regular customers at the store, with neighbors who now nodded greeting instead of staring curiously. "Thank you," she said suddenly, the words inadequate for what she meant to express. James looked at her questioningly. "For everything, for offering shelter when I had nowhere to go, for treating me with respect when others might have assumed the worst, for..." She hesitated, "for giving me time to find my footing without pressure or expectation." Something softened in his weathered face. "Everyone deserves a chance to stand on their own terms, Catherine. I've just provided the space for you to do that." The simple dignity of his perspective touched her deeply. Here was a man who helped others, not from condescension or to create obligation, but from a fundamental belief in offering fellow humans the same respect he would wish for himself. Their conversation might have continued, but the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted. The moment a rider appeared on the road leading to the house, moving at an urgent pace despite the gathering dusk. James rose, instantly alert in a way that recalled his years as sheriff. "That's Martin Reynolds," he said, identifying the rider before Catherine could make out details. "Something's wrong. He wouldn't come at this hour otherwise." By the time Martin Reynolds reached the house, James had descended to the yard to meet him. Catherine remained on the porch, watching as the rider dismounted in haste, his expression visible even in the fading light. "James," the man called, not bothering with formalities. "Bad trouble at the North Ridge. Jackson's boy and the Peterson. Girl went riding this morning and haven't returned. Storms building in the mountains, and the search parties found nothing. We need every man who knows that terrain." James was already moving toward the barn. "Give me 5 minutes to saddle." "Up." Martin nodded, then noticed Catherine on the porch. "Evening, Miss Miller. Sorry to interrupt." His attention returned immediately to James, who had emerged from the barn, leading his horse. "Sheriff Thompson's organizing from the Weston's ranch. They're using it as a base since it's closest to where the kids were last seen." James swung into the saddle with an ease that belied his years, then turned to Catherine. "Don't wait up. This might take all night, especially if that storm hits." "Be careful," she called as both men turned their horses toward the road. "Lock the doors," James replied, his voice already fading as they rode away. Catherine watched until they disappeared into the gathering darkness, then returned inside as instructed, securing the doors. A precaution she understood was more habit than necessity in this remote location. The house felt suddenly larger and emptier without James's steady presence. Unable to settle, she moved through familiar evening routines, banking the fire, washing the dinner dishes, preparing for the next day's early rising. Yet anxiety lingered. She had heard enough about Montana's unpredictable mountain weather to understand the danger facing both the missing young people and those searching for them. Eventually, she settled in the chair by the front window, a book open but unread in her lap, as she gazed toward the mountains now invisible in the night. Rain began to fall, gentle at first, then with increasing intensity until it drummed against the roof with persistent force. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed by the low rumble of thunder. Hours passed this way, Catherine moving occasionally to stoke the fire but always returning to her vigil by the window. Sleep was impossible while James faced potential danger. This realization that his safety had become profoundly important to her arrived with quiet clarity amid the storm's tumult. It was well past midnight when the sound of hoofbeats once again approached the house. Catherine hurried to the door, lantern in hand, to find James dismounting slowly, his movements betraying exhaustion. Rain plastered his hair to his head and dripped from his oilskin coat. "You found them," she called, holding the lantern higher. James nodded as he led his horse toward the barn. Sheltering in an old trapper's cabin just below the ridge, cold and frightened, but unharmed. Relief washed through Catherine. She waited until he had tended to his horse before meeting him on the porch with a towel and steaming cup of coffee. "You must be frozen through." "Been worse," he replied, accepting both offerings with gratitude, though not recently. Inside, James sank into his chair by the fire, steam rising from his damp clothes. Catherine brought him a plate of reheated stew she'd kept warming, watching as he ate with the mechanical motions of a man running on determination rather than energy. "The parents must be relieved," she said when he had finished eating. "Peterson nearly collapsed when we brought Emily back." James set aside his empty plate. "Jackson tries to be stoic, but I saw him holding his boy like he might disappear again." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Those two will be hearing about this adventure for years to come." Catherine could imagine the scene. Frantic parents, reunited with children who had yet to understand the magnitude of the worry they'd caused. What happened to them? Decided to explore an area beyond where they were permitted to go. Horse threw a shoe and they had to continue on foot. Got turned around in unfamiliar territory. James shook his head. Could have ended much worse. If the weather had hit sooner, or if they hadn't found that cabin. The casual way he referenced potential tragedy reminded Catherine of the harsh realities of frontier life. How quickly circumstances could turn deadly, how thin the margin sometimes was between safety and disaster. Yet James and men like him faced these dangers regularly, not as acts of bravado, but as necessary responses to community need. "You should get some rest," she said, noticing how his eyelids drooped despite his efforts to remain alert. James nodded, too exhausted to argue. As he rose to retire to his room, he paused. "Thank you for waiting up. Wasn't necessary, but..." He seemed to search for the right words. "It's good to have someone to come home to." The simple statement lingered in Catherine's mind long after James had disappeared into his room. It was the first time either of them had acknowledged, even obliquely, that their arrangement had evolved beyond mere practicality into something that provided mutual comfort. The search for the missing children marked a turning point in Catherine's relationship with the broader community. Her evident concern during the crisis and her care for James upon his return were noticed and remarked upon favorably. The story traveled through Silver Creek's networks in the way of small towns, subtly shifting her status from object of curiosity to recognized member of the community. Hannah confirmed this change when Catherine next worked at the store. "Mrs. Peterson came in specifically asking if you'd be here today," she reported. "Wanted to thank you personally for your part in the search." "My part?" Catherine asked, confused. "I didn't do anything." Hannah gave her a knowing look. "You kept the home fires burning for one of the searchers. That counts for something around here, where everyone's contribution matters." Sure enough, Emily Peterson's mother appeared mid-morning, bringing a freshly baked loaf of bread as a token of appreciation. "Mr. Parker was out half the night helping," "But my girl," she explained, pressing the bread into Catherine's hands, "least I can do is make sure his household is well fed after such exertion." To the simple gesture, acknowledging Catherine as the proper recipient of household-directed gratitude, confirmed her evolving place in the community's social structure. No longer merely that Eastern girl staying with James Parker, she had acquired a recognized role, if not yet a permanent one. Summer arrived with long, sun-drenched days that transformed the landscape. Catherine's hours at the store increased as Hannah expanded business to accommodate the seasonal influx of travelers, cowboys, and traders passing through Silver Creek. The work suited her, varied enough to remain interesting, structured enough to provide security, and connected enough to satisfy her growing appreciation for community life. One sweltering afternoon in early July, as Catherine organized a shipment of dry goods that had just arrived on the weekly freight wagon, the store's bell jangled to announce a customer. She looked up to see Thomas Wilson standing hesitantly in the doorway, hat in hand. Their paths had crossed occasionally in the months since her arrival, but always in public settings, where social convention dictated polite distance. This direct encounter, the first since her humiliating rejection at the train station, sent heat rising to Catherine's cheeks that had nothing to do with the summer temperature. "Miss Miller," Wilson greeted her, his discomfort evident in his stiff posture. "I didn't realize you'd be working today." "Mr. Wilson," she acknowledged with a composure that surprised even herself. "Hannah's visiting her sister in Helena. I'm managing the store until her return next week. How may I help you?" Wilson cleared his throat. "Just needed some fence staples and coffee." He glanced around as if hoping these items might materialize without further interaction. "Fence staples are along the back wall," Catherine directed, her professional demeanor firmly in place. "Coffee's just been restocked. How many pounds would you like?" The transaction proceeded with formal politeness on both sides. As Catherine wrapped his purchases in brown paper, Wilson seemed to reach some internal decision. "Miss Miller," he began, then hesitated. "I feel I should explain about our, situation. When we corresponded, I had envisioned someone—" "Mr. Wilson," Catherine interrupted gently. "No explanation is necessary. What's past is past." He persisted. "It's just that appearances matter in a small town, and at my age, with a young bride who looked even younger." "I understand completely," Catherine assured him, anxious to end this awkward conversation. "In fact, I've come to believe things worked out for the best." This was not merely a polite fiction. She had indeed concluded that marriage to Thomas Wilson would have been a mistake for both of them. Wilson appeared startled by this response, perhaps having expected lingering resentment. "You're content with your situation then, living at Parker's place?" "I am," Catherine replied simply. "Silver Creek has been very welcoming." She handed him his wrapped parcels. "That will be $3.45. After Wilson departed, Catherine found herself smiling at the encounter that had once seemed so potentially mortifying. Time and perspective had transformed rejection from catastrophe to mere redirection. Had Wilson accepted her as his bride, she would never have developed the independence she now cherished, never have discovered her aptitude for commerce, never have experienced the particular satisfaction of making her own way. Most significantly, she would never have known James Parker, a man whose quiet integrity and fundamental decency had reshaped her understanding of what masculine strength truly meant. Not dominance or financial power, but the security to help others without diminishing them, to offer support without demanding submission in return. That evening, as they sat on the porch, enjoying the cooler air that came with sunset, Catherine recounted her encounter with Wilson to James. To her surprise, he chuckled. "What's amusing?" she asked. Just thinking about how things turn out sometimes, James replied. 3 months ago, meeting Wilson would have tied your stomach in knots. Now it's just an anecdote from your day. Catherine considered this observation. I suppose that's true. It's strange how quickly catastrophe can transform into mere circumstance. That's life, James said simply. Most disasters look different with time and distance. He studied her for a moment. You've changed since you arrived. Have I? He nodded. Stand taller, speak more directly, seem more settled in yourself. He leaned back in his chair. Suits you. Coming from a man of few compliments, the observation warmed her unexpectedly. Thank you. I feel more settled, more substantial somehow. James seemed to understand exactly what she meant. Having purpose does that for a person, gives weight to living. They lapsed into comfortable silence, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue above the mountains. Eventually, James spoke again, his tone careful. Hannah mentioned she's offered you a permanent position at the store. Full partner eventually, if things continue well. Catherine nodded, surprised that Hannah had discussed the matter with him before their agreement was finalized. She raised the possibility last week. I haven't given her my answer yet. It's a good opportunity, James observed neutrally. Hannah's built something substantial there. No better mentor for business in these parts. I know, Catherine agreed. It's more than I could have hoped for when I arrived. James turned to face her directly, which raises a question I've been meaning to ask. Your arrangement here was temporary, a refuge until you found your feet. Seems you've done that now. He paused. Have you thought about what comes next? Where you'll live once you're established at the store? The question caught Catherine unprepared. Somehow, despite the explicitly temporary nature of their original arrangement, she had stopped thinking of her residence with James as provisional. The house had become home, their routine familiar and comforting. The prospect of leaving created an unexpected hollow feeling in her chest. I hadn't given it much thought, she admitted, though I suppose it would be proper to find my own accommodations. Eventually, James was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. No hurry on my account, he said finally. The arrangement has worked well enough. Something in his tone, a careful neutrality that seemed to mask deeper considerations, prompted Catherine to wonder if there might be more behind his question than practical planning. Before she could formulate a response that might invite further revelation, however, the moment was interrupted by the distant sound of galloping hooves. Both turned toward the road, where a rider was approaching at speed despite the fading light. As the figure drew closer, Catherine recognized the distinctive hat and posture of Sheriff Thompson, James's successor in office. James rose, frowning. Thompson wouldn't be riding out this late unless something serious had happened. The sheriff reined his horse to a stop in the yard, dismounting with the fluid motion of a younger man. "Evening, James," he called, then nodded acknowledgement. To Catherine, "Miss Miller, what brings you out at this hour, Frank?" James asked, already moving toward the steps, as if anticipating the need for action. Sheriff Thompson removed his hat, revealing a deeply troubled expression. "Bad business, James. Stagecoach was robbed 10 miles south of town. Driver killed. Passengers roughed up pretty bad. One of them's just a boy, maybe 10 or 11. Catherine gasped softly at this news, her hand rising involuntarily to her throat. James's expression hardened into the focused alertness she had come to recognize as his response to crisis. "Bascom's gang?" he asked, naming an outlaw group that had been plaguing the region sporadically for months. Thompson nodded grimly. "Looks that way. 3 men, bandanas covering their faces, but one had that distinctive limp witnesses have mentioned. Before..." He hesitated before continuing. "I've got the passengers at Doc Stevens's place in town. The boy's in bad shape. took a blow to the head when he tried to protect his mother. Doc's doing what he can, but he left the sentence unfinished, its implications clear. "What do you need from me?" James asked without hesitation. "Two things. First, your experience. You dealt with Bascom once before, back when you wore the badge. Need your insight." Thompson's expression grew more grave. "Second, we're forming a tracking party at first light. Could use someone who knows the southern country as well as you do." James nodded, his decision already made. "I'll come into a town with you now. We can talk strategy, and I'll join the tracking party in the morning." He turned to Catherine. "I might be gone a few days. Will you be all right here alone?" "Of course," she assured him, though the prospect of his absence, especially on such a potentially dangerous mission, sent anxiety coursing through her. "Don't worry about me." As James went inside to gather what he would need, Sheriff Thompson remained in the yard, his discomfort evident. After a moment's hesitation, he approached Catherine, where she stood on the porch. "Miss Miller," he began awkwardly, "I wouldn't have asked James to join this pursuit if there was any other option. But Bascom's dangerous, and we need every experienced man we can get." "I understand," Catherine said, though her heart constricted at the confirmation of danger. "James wouldn't have it any other way." Thompson studied her with unexpected perception. "He thinks highly of you, you know, speaks of your courage in coming west alone, building a new life here." Before Catherine could respond to this surprising revelation, James emerged from the house carrying a small pack and his rifle. His expression was focused, reminiscent of the former lawman rather than the quiet rancher she had come to know. "Ready," he said simply. As he mounted his horse, James turned to Catherine one final time. "Bolt the doors. Martin Reynolds knows. I'm going. He'll ride by each day to check on you. If there's trouble, fire 3 shots in the air and he'll come running." Catherine nodded, committing these instructions to memory while trying to project a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "Be careful," she called as the men prepared to depart. "Always am," James replied with a reassuring nod. "Back before? You know it." She watched until the darkness swallowed them completely, then entered the house, securing each door and window as directed. The spaces that had become so familiar over the past months suddenly seemed cavernous and empty without James's presence. Sleep proved elusive that night. Catherine lay awake, listening to the normal sounds of the Montana night, now rendered somehow ominous by the news of violence so relatively nearby. The thought of James facing armed outlaws sent waves of anxiety through her that no amount of rationalization could entirely dispel. Morning arrived with no further news. Catherine performed her usual routines mechanically, finding small comfort in the familiar motions of making coffee, feeding the chickens, and tending the vegetable garden James had helped her establish near the house. She jumped at every distant sound, half expecting, half hoping it might be James returning unexpectedly. By noon, with no sign of either James or the promised visit from Martin Reynolds, Catherine determined to ride into town herself to learn what news might be available. James had taught her basic horsemanship over the past months, not to the level of the Montana-born women who rode as comfortably as they walked, but adequately for the short journey to Silver Creek. The town appeared unusually subdued when she arrived, with knots of people gathered in conversation outside the general store and sheriff's office. Catherine directed her mount toward Green's store, where Hannah would likely have the most current information. Inside, she found Hannah serving a group of ranch wives who were stocking up on supplies, a common response to perceived threats, ensuring households had necessities in case of extended trouble. The women fell silent when Catherine entered, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and concern. "Any news?" Catherine asked, without preamble, once the customers had departed. Hannah shook her head. "Tracking party left at dawn. James, Sheriff Thompson, the Jenkins brothers, and 4 other men." Doc Stevens is still treating the stagecoach passengers, the boys holding on, but it's touch and go. Catherine absorbed this information, trying to maintain her composure. How long might they be gone? Hard to say. Depends on the trail, the weather, whether Bascom tries to stand and fight or just run. Hannah studied Catherine with understanding. You're worried about him. It wasn't a question, but Catherine answered anyway. Yes. Hannah's expression softened. James Parker's been handling trouble in these parts since before either of us was born. If anyone can track Bascom safely, it's him. Catherine nodded, grateful for the reassurance even as worry continued to gnaw at her. I should get back to the house. James asked Martin Reynolds to check on me, but he hasn't come by yet. Martin rode out with the search party for the first few miles, then split off to alert the outlying ranches, Hannah explained. He'll likely stop by later today. The ride back to James's house seemed longer, the landscape suddenly vast and empty in a way Catherine hadn't perceived before. She found herself scanning the horizon constantly, alert for any sign of movement that might indicate either James's return or potential threat. True to Hannah's prediction, Martin Reynolds appeared late that afternoon, riding up to the house, with casual confidence that suggested no immediate danger. Miss Miller, he called in greeting. James asked me to check in. Everything all right here? Yes, thank you, Catherine replied, emerging onto the porch. Any news of the tracking? A party? Martin dismounted, accepting the glass of water she offered. They found sign heading south toward the Badlands. Sheriff sent a rider back with that information before they continued on. He hesitated. Might be a few days before they return. Bascom knows that country well. Catherine nodded, concealing her concern behind the practical facade she had learned to maintain during her months in Silver Creek. I appreciate you riding out to check on things. No trouble, Martin assured her. I'll stop by again tomorrow. If you need anything before then, just fire those 3 shots James mentioned. Sound carries in these hills. I'll hear it from my place. After he departed, Catherine found herself facing the prospect of a long, solitary evening. The house, which had become a place of comfort and security, now seemed filled with reminders of James's absence, his empty chair by the fire, his coffee mug on the shelf, his books neatly arranged on the small table where he read most evenings. She tried to occupy herself with practical tasks, mending that had been set aside, bread preparation for the following day, organizing her growing collection of personal possessions that had expanded beyond the single trunk she had arrived with. Yet anxiety remained her constant companion, surfacing whenever her mind had a moment to wander. Night fell with agonizing slowness. Catherine secured the house as James had instructed, keeping his rifle nearby, though she had only the most rudimentary knowledge of its operation. Every sound, a branch scraping against the roof, an owl's call, the distant howling of coyotes, took on potential significance in the darkness. Dawn arrived after a mostly sleepless night, bringing no news but at least the comfort of daylight. Catherine forced herself to maintain normal routines, aware that allowing fear to dictate her actions would only increase her distress. She worked in the garden, tended the few animals James kept, and prepared food she had little appetite to eat. Martin Reynolds' daily visits became her primary connection to news from town. On the 3rd day of James's absence, he arrived earlier than usual, his expression grave in a way that immediately sent Catherine's heart racing. What is it? She asked before he had fully dismounted. Has something happened to James? Martin held up a calming hand. No news of the tracking party yet. It's something else. He removed his hat, a gesture Catherine had come to recognize as a prelude to difficult information. There was trouble in town last night. A man was found going through the back of Green's store after closing. Hannah confronted him and he struck her, knocked her unconscious and fled. Catherine gasped, her hand rising to her mouth. "Hannah? Is she—" "She'll recover," Martin assured her quickly. "Doc Stevens says it's a concussion, nothing worse, but she's confined to bed for at least a week." He hesitated before continuing. "The store's closed up tight for now, which is causing problems for folks who rely on those supplies. Hannah's been asking for you, says if you're willing, you know the operation well enough to keep it running until she's back on her feet." The request momentarily displaced Catherine's worry about James. Hannah, who had given her opportunity when others might have shunned her, now needed her assistance. There was no question of refusal. "Of course I'll help," she said immediately. "When does she need me to start?" "As soon as possible. The Wilsons are staying with her to help with personal needs, but the store—" Martin shrugged. "People are depending on it." Catherine nodded decisively. "I'll gather what I need and ride in with you now." She hesitated, glancing back. "At the house, but James asked me to stay here. If he returns—" "I'll make sure word gets to him immediately," Martin promised. "And you can return each evening if you prefer, rather than staying in town. I'd be happy to escort you." Within half an hour, Catherine had packed necessities for maintaining the store, secured the house, and mounted her horse to accompany Martin back to Silver Creek. As they rode, he filled her in on additional details about the attack at the store. "Sheriff's deputy thinks it might be connected to the stagecoach robbery," he explained. "The timing's suspicious. Most of our capable men out tracking Bascom, leaving the town vulnerable." This perspective heightened Catherine's anxiety, but also strengthened her resolve. Silver Creek had become her community. Its needs were now her concern as well. If she could support that community during this difficult time, she would do so regardless of personal apprehension. Hannah's quarters above the store were modest but comfortable. A sitting room, bedroom, and small kitchen that reflected their owner's practical nature. Catherine found her propped up in bed, her normally vibrant face pale beneath a bandage wrapped around her head. Despite obvious pain, Hannah's relief at seeing Catherine was evident. "Thank heavens," she murmured as Catherine entered the bedroom. "I was afraid you might not come." "Of course I came," Catherine replied, taking the older woman's hand. "How could I not?" Hannah managed a weak smile. "The store will be fine," Catherine assured her. "I'll handle everything until you're well enough to return. You just focus on recovering." Hannah squeezed her hand gratefully. "Keys are in the top drawer of my desk. Daily ledger shows what orders are outstanding. Wednesday's freight wagon will arrive as usual. Invoice is pinned to the message board." "Don't worry about any of that," Catherine insisted. "Rest now. I'll check on you regularly between customers." Downstairs, Catherine unlocked the store and surveyed the scene. Evidence of the previous night's altercation remained visible. An overturned display near the back counter, merchandise scattered across the floor, a small bloodstain where Hannah had fallen. Catherine set about restoring order efficiently, drawing on the organizational skills she had developed during her months working alongside Hannah. By the time she opened the front door and turned the sign to open, the store had resumed its normal appearance. Customers arrived quickly, many expressing both concern for Hannah and gratitude to Catherine for keeping the essential business operating. "Don't know what we'd do without this place," Mrs. Peterson commented as Catherine weighed flour for her order. "You're doing the town a real service, Miss Miller." Throughout that first day, Catherine moved between serving customers and checking on Hannah, bringing her broth and tea prepared by Mrs. Wilson, who had temporarily taken over caring for the injured shopkeeper. By closing time, exhaustion had replaced anxiety as Catherine's primary sensation, leaving little energy for dwelling on worries about James's continued absence. Martin Reynolds arrived as promised to escort her back to James's house, but Hannah weakly protested this arrangement from her sickbed. "Nonsense," she murmured. "Too much riding back and forth. Stay in my guest room. It's all prepared, much more practical." Too tired to argue, Catherine accepted this solution for at least the first night. The small room adjacent to Hannah's bedroom was indeed neatly prepared, with a narrow bed and simple furnishings that offered welcome respite after the demanding day. Sleep came swiftly despite her unfamiliar surroundings, but it was not destined to last. Sometime in the deepest part of night, Catherine awakened suddenly, every sense alert, though she couldn't immediately identify what had disturbed her. Then she heard it, a soft scraping sound from downstairs, followed by the muffled thud of something heavy being moved. Someone was in the store. Catherine's heart pounded as she registered the significance of the sounds. Someone had broken into Green's store below, possibly the same person who had attacked Hannah. With the sheriff and most capable men away tracking the Bascom gang, there were few protections for the businesses in Silver Creek. For a moment, she remained frozen in bed, barely breathing as she strained to hear more. The sounds continued. Careful, but deliberate movements of someone trying to remain undetected. Catherine slipped from beneath the covers, grateful that the practical nature of frontier life had led her to sleep in a cotton nightgown that required no corset or complex fastenings. The guest room contained nothing that might serve as a weapon. In Hannah's adjoining room, the shopkeeper slept the heavy sleep of the medicated, unaware of the danger below. Catherine had to make a decision, attempt to quietly wake Mrs. Wilson. Across the hall, slip out to find help, or confront the intruder herself. The first muffled crash from below made the decision for her. Whatever the intruder sought, they were becoming less cautious, which meant Hannah might soon awaken and potentially place herself in danger. Catherine couldn't allow that to happen. Moving with deliberate care to avoid creaking floorboards, she crept to Hannah's bedside table, where she had earlier noticed a small derringer, the practical woman's protection in a frontier town. Her hand closed around the unfamiliar weight of the weapon, her mind racing through the basic instructions James had once casually provided during a conversation about self-defense. The narrow back stairs that connected Hannah's living quarters to the store would allow Catherine to descend undetected if she moved carefully enough. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, she eased out of the bedroom and toward the staircase, straining to track the intruder's location by sound alone. The store lay in near-complete darkness, illuminated only by faint moonlight filtering through front windows. As Catherine reached the bottom of the stairs, she could make out a shadowy figure moving near Hannah's desk, rifling through drawers with increasing frustration. "Stop right there," Catherine commanded, her voice stronger than she felt. She raised the derringer, hoping the intruder wouldn't notice how her hand trembled. "I've got a gun pointed at you." The figure froze, then slowly straightened. "Little lady playing with firearms," a man's voice drawled, the accent unfamiliar to Catherine's ear. "Dangerous game." "The sheriff's deputy is on his way," Catherine bluffed, maintaining her position at the foot of the stairs. "I suggest you leave while you can." A low chuckle answered her. "No, he ain't. Sheriff and his men are chasing ghosts in the Badlands. Nobody coming to help you." The figure took a step toward her, moonlight glinting briefly on something metallic in his hand. "Now, why don't you put that little gun down before you hurt yourself?" Catherine's mind raced. The man clearly knew about the tracking party, confirming Martin's suspicion of a connection between the stagecoach robbery and Hannah's attack. "Stay back," she warned as he took another step. "I know how to use this." It was another bluff. She had never fired a gun in her life, but she infused the words with all the conviction she could muster. The intruder paused, seeming to reassess the situation. "All I want is what's in the safe," he said, gesturing toward the small metal box, partially visible behind the counter. "Give me that, and I'll be on my way." Catherine knew the safe contained not only the store's money, but payments Hannah collected for other businesses in town. The livery, the blacksmith, even wages for schoolteacher Miss Winters. The collective economy of Silver Creek flowed through Green's general store in a way Catherine had come to understand during her employment there. "I don't have the combination," she said truthfully. "The old woman upstairs does," the man replied, taking another step toward Catherine. "So either you go get it from her, or I will, and I won't be as polite as I'm being with you." The threat to Hannah galvanized Catherine's resolve. James had once told her that in dangerous situations, unexpected action often provided the best advantage. Without further warning, she fired the derringer at the floorboards near the intruder's feet. The report was deafening in the confined space. The intruder jumped back with a startled curse, momentarily thrown off balance. Catherine used that second of confusion to dash behind the nearest counter, putting solid oak between herself and the threat. "The next shot won't be a warning," she called, ducking down as the man recovered his composure. "You little—" His expletive was cut short by the sound of voices and running footsteps outside. The gunshot had accomplished what Catherine's bluff could not. It had alerted neighbors to trouble at the store. The intruder hesitated only briefly before bolting toward the back door through which he had presumably entered. Catherine heard it slam as shouts came from the street in front. Moments later, the store's front door rattled as someone tried the locked entrance. "Miss Miller, Hannah, is everyone all right in there?" The voice belonged to Mr. Peterson, the feed merchant whose shop stood across the street. Weak with relief, Catherine emerged from behind the counter. "I'm here," she called, moving toward the door with shaking legs. "An intruder broke in, but he's gone out the back." By the time she had unlocked the door, a small crowd had gathered. Mr. Peterson and the blacksmith in front, several other townspeople behind them, all in various states of nightdress. The deputy sheriff arrived moments later, hastily buckling his gun belt as he pushed through the concerned neighbors. "What happened?" he demanded, taking in Catherine's nightgown and the derringer still clutched in her hand. Catherine explained as clearly as her jangled nerves allowed. Above, Mrs. Wilson appeared at the top of the stairs with a lamp, her expression alarmed. "Hannah's still asleep," she reported. "The laudanum Doc Stevens gave her must have kept her under despite the commotion." The deputy organized several men into a search party for the intruder, though Catherine suspected he was long gone. Others insisted on checking the store thoroughly to ensure no one else lurked in shadowed corners. By the time relative calm had been restored, dawn was approaching, washing the eastern horizon with faint pink light. "You showed remarkable courage, Miss Miller," the deputy told her as the last of the neighbors departed. "Most would have hidden or fled." "I couldn't let him threaten Hannah," Catherine replied simply, looking around at the disrupted store. Drawers emptied onto the floor, merchandise scattered in the intruder's hasty retreat. She added, "I should start cleaning this up before customers arrive." The deputy shook his head in amazement. "After what you've been through, you're thinking about opening the store?" "People depend on it," Catherine said, the truth of this statement having become increasingly clear during her time in Silver Creek. Life doesn't stop because of one alarming night. Word of Catherine's confrontation with the intruder spread through Silver Creek with the rising sun. By the time she officially opened the store, somewhat later than usual, but open, nonetheless, customers arrived with expressions of concern, admiration, and in some cases, revised assessment. Even the Everett sisters, those self-appointed arbiters of community morality, stopped by to express their approval of her actions. "Very brave indeed," the elder Miss Everett pronounced, as if bestowing a royal commendation. "Perhaps unconventional in your arrangements, but clearly a woman of substance." Catherine accepted this backhanded compliment with the gravity it deserved, suspecting that in the currency of Silver Creek's social standing, she had just received a significant deposit. The community that had initially viewed her with curiosity, tinged with suspicion, now saw her as one of their own, someone who had placed their collective welfare above personal safety. Hannah, upon awakening and learning what had transpired, insisted on coming downstairs, despite Mrs. Wilson's protests. Pale and unsteady but determined, she surveyed the restored order Catherine had achieved, then turned to her with moist eyes. "You protected my store," she said simply, "and me." "You would have done the same," Catherine replied, uncomfortable with the emotion in the older woman's voice. Hannah nodded acknowledgement of this truth. "Partnership offer still stands," she said, her practical nature reasserting itself even through obvious pain. More convinced than ever, it's the right decision. The day passed in a blur of activity as Catherine managed the store while simultaneously tending to Hannah's needs and answering the deputy's periodic questions about the intruder. By closing time, exhaustion had settled into her bones, yet she felt a curious sense of accomplishment. In the face of danger, she had not faltered. In the aftermath, she had persevered. These were not small victories for a woman who had once measured her worth by her ability to endure rather than confront. That evening, as she was securing the store's front door, Martin Reynolds appeared with unexpected news. "Ryder just came in from the tracking party," he reported. "They've captured 2 of Bascom's men and recovered most of the stolen money. They'll be returning tomorrow." Relief washed through Catherine like a physical force. "And James? Is he all right?" Martin smiled. "Apparently it was his tracking skills that led them to Bascom's hideout. Sheriff says they couldn't have done it without him." The knowledge that James would soon return, safely, lifted a weight Catherine hadn't fully acknowledged carrying. She realized with sudden clarity how deeply his welfare had become entwined with her sense of home and security. It was a recognition, both comforting and unsettling. To care so much about another person's safety created vulnerability she had long sought to avoid. True to Martin's report, the tracking party returned to Silver Creek late the following afternoon. Catherine, managing the store alone while Hannah rested upstairs, heard the commotion before she saw the cause. Cheers and calls from townspeople as riders appeared at the far end of the main street. She stepped onto the boardwalk just as the procession passed. 2 sullen prisoners bound and flanked by armed men, Sheriff Thompson at the lead. And there, riding slightly behind, was James, dusty, unshaven, but wonderfully, gloriously intact. Their eyes met briefly as he passed, his weathered face breaking into a smile that transformed his features from exhaustion to warmth in an instant. Catherine raised her hand in greeting, unable to trust her voice with the emotion that suddenly constricted her throat. The tracking party continued toward the jail, where a crowd quickly gathered to witness the prisoners' transfer and hear the sheriff's account of their capture. Catherine returned to the store, knowing James would find her when his duties were complete. It was nearly dusk when the store's bell jangled and James entered, hat in hand, his appearance suggesting he had taken time to wash and change before seeking her out. "Heard you've had some excitement while I was away," he said by way of greeting, his tone light, though his eyes were serious. "Nothing compared to chasing armed outlaws," Catherine replied, maintaining the same casual tone despite the rapid acceleration of her pulse. James stepped closer, his expression shifting to one of genuine concern. "Martin told me what happened. Are you all right?" The simple question, asked not for information but from care, breached the composure Catherine had maintained through 2 difficult days. To her horror, tears welled in her eyes. "I am now," she managed, hastily wiping away the unwelcome moisture. James moved with surprising quickness for a man his age, closing the remaining distance between them and placing steady hands on her shoulders. "Catherine," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "what you did was incredibly brave and incredibly foolish. You could have been killed." "Hannah needed protection," she replied, regaining control of her emotions. "And the store. It's important to the town. Yes, James agreed, but you are important too. His hands tightened slightly on her shoulders as if to emphasize this point. When I heard what happened, He stopped, seeming to struggle with words, then continued more quietly. It matters to me that you're safe. The simple declaration, delivered without embellishment or expectation, touched Catherine deeply. In Boston, her value had been determined by her utility to employers, to landlords, to an economic system that viewed her as replaceable. Here, in this moment, she was being told with absolute sincerity that her safety, her very existence, mattered to another person, not for what she could provide, but simply because she was herself. It matters to me that you're safe too, she admitted, holding his gaze. These past days, not knowing if you were in danger? James nodded, understanding. Seems we've both had cause to worry about each other. A hint of his rare smile appeared. Perhaps that tells us something worth considering. Before Catherine could respond to this oblique suggestion, Hannah's voice called from the back stairs. Is that James Parker I hear? About time you showed up. Come tell me how you caught those miscreants while Catherine closes up the store. The moment between them shifted, but didn't disappear. As James moved toward Hannah's summons, he paused, touching Catherine's hand briefly. We'll talk more later. At home. Home. The word lingered in Catherine's mind as she completed closing procedures. James hadn't said, my home, or the house, but simply home, a place that somehow, despite its temporary status in her original understanding, had come to belong to both of them. That evening, after ensuring Hannah was comfortably settled, with Mrs. Wilson in attendance, Catherine rode back to James's house, their home, beside him, the familiar landscape taking on fresh significance in the gathering dusk. Neither spoke much, the events of recent days having created a companionable understanding that required few words. Upon arriving, Catherine moved automatically to prepare a meal, while James tended to the horses and checked the property after his absence. Their domestic routine resumed as if days of separation and danger had been merely a brief interruption rather than a fundamental shift in perception. Over a simple supper of stew and biscuits, James recounted the tracking party's experiences. The difficult trail through the Badlands, the surprise raid on Bascom's hideout, the gunfight that had resulted in one outlaw's death, and the capture of two others. Bascom himself had escaped, but with his gang dispersed and most of the stolen money recovered, the immediate threat had been neutralized. Sheriff thinks Bascom will head for Wyoming territory, James concluded. Too hot for him around here now. And the intruder at the store, was he connected to Bascom? Catherine asked. James nodded. Deputy showed me his description. Matches a man known to ride with Bascom occasionally, Mitchell or Mitchum something, like that. Likely trying to create a distraction or gather supplies while the main gang was being pursued. This confirmation of the connection between the two incidents reinforced Catherine's belief that her actions had been necessary, if frightening. She had protected not just Hannah and the store, but potentially the broader community from further predation. Hannah asked me again about the partnership, she mentioned, as they cleared away supper dishes. Said the incident convinced her more than ever that I'm the right person to eventually take over the business. James nodded approvingly. It's a good opportunity. Hannah's built something substantial there, and she's not getting any younger. She needs someone she can trust. I'm inclined to accept, Catherine admitted. It would mean establishing myself here permanently. In Silver Creek, James clarified, his tone neutral. Catherine looked at him directly. Yes, in Silver Creek. She hesitated, then added more softly, though we haven't discussed what that might mean for current arrangements. James set down the plate he was drying, his expression thoughtful. Current arrangements, he repeated. You mean you're living here? Yes. James seemed to choose his next words with care. "When I offered you a place to stay, it was meant to be temporary, a refuge until you found your footing. You've done that now, more successfully than anyone might have predicted." Catherine nodded, her heart constricting slightly at what seemed to be leading toward the conclusion of their arrangement. "I have, and I'm grateful for the opportunity you provided. The thing is," James continued, moving away from the basin to face her more directly, "what began as a practical solution has become something else, at least for me." He ran a hand through his silver hair, a gesture Catherine had come to recognize as indicating emotional territory he found challenging to navigate. "These past months, having you here has made this house feel like a home again, and these past days, being away, knowing you were facing potential danger." He shook his head. "It clarified some things for me." Catherine waited, scarcely, breathing as James gathered his thoughts. "I'm not offering romance, Catherine," he said finally, his gaze steady on hers. "I'm too old for that, and you deserve better, but I can offer respect, security, and companionship, a real home, not just temporary shelter." His voice softened. "If you wanted to stay permanently, I would consider it a privilege, not an obligation." The offer hung between them, its significance momentous despite the simplicity of its presentation. Catherine considered what was being proposed, not a passionate love match, but a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine care, a foundation perhaps more solid than romantic infatuation could provide. "Are you suggesting marriage?" she asked, needing absolute clarity. "I am," James confirmed, "though I understand if you find the idea unsuitable. The age difference alone is significant," Catherine acknowledged, "but perhaps less important than other factors." She moved closer to him, her decision crystallizing with unexpected certainty. "In Boston, I accepted Thomas Wilson's proposal because I was desperate for escape. I would have married a stranger for the promise of something different from the life I had." James nodded, his expression carefully neutral as he waited for her to continue. "Now," Catherine said, "I find myself considering marriage not from desperation, but from choice. Not to a stranger, but to someone I've come to know and respect deeply." She met his gaze directly. "Someone who has shown me what it means to be valued for who I am, rather than what I can provide." "Is that a yes?" James asked, a hint of his rare smile beginning to emerge. "It's a yes," Catherine confirmed, "on one condition. Name it. That we both acknowledge this arrangement may change with time," she said carefully. "That what begins as practical companionship might become something more." The smile that transformed James's weathered face contained a warmth Catherine had glimpsed only rarely. "I believe that's acceptable, Miss Miller," he said, taking her hand in his. The touch was gentle but sure, like the man himself. They were married 2 weeks later in Silver Creek's small church, after Hannah had recovered sufficiently to stand as Catherine's witness. The ceremony was simple but well attended, the community turning out to celebrate the union of their former sheriff and the young woman who had arrived under unconventional circumstances but had proven herself one of their own. Thomas Wilson attended somewhat awkwardly, but with seeming genuine goodwill. "Worked out for the best," he told Catherine, during the modest reception that followed. "Though I admit I never saw this outcome when you stepped off that train." "Nor did I," Catherine acknowledged with a smile. "Life has a way of rearranging our expectations." Summer gave way to autumn, bringing spectacular color to the mountains surrounding Silver Creek. Catherine divided her time between the store, where her partnership with Hannah was now formalized, and the home she shared with James. Their domestic routines evolved naturally, each finding unexpected satisfaction in the rhythms of shared life. News eventually reached Silver Creek of an orphaned boy discovered in a mining camp north of town. a child of perhaps 10, abused and neglected by the rough men who had reluctantly assumed his care after his parents' deaths. The county commissioner, at a loss for placement options, approached James with a request. "Just until more suitable arrangements can be made," the commissioner explained during a visit to their home. "Given your experience in law enforcement and Miss Miller's, forgive me, Mrs. Parker's, gentle nature, it seemed the most appropriate temporary solution." Catherine and James exchanged glances, a silent communication that had developed between them over months of partnership. "We'd be willing to consider it," James said carefully, "though the boy should have some say in the matter." The following day, the commissioner returned with Daniel, thin, wary, his eyes holding the guarded expression of a child who had learned to expect little kindness from adults. Catherine recognized that look. She had worn it herself during her final years in Boston. "This is Mr. and Mrs. Parker," the commissioner introduced them. "They've offered to give you a place to stay while we sort out more permanent arrangements." Daniel regarded them suspiciously, saying nothing. His gaze traveled from James's weathered face to Catherine's more youthful one, clearly trying to make sense of their unlikely pairing. "We have a spare room," Catherine said gently, "and plenty of food, no obligations, just a safe place to stay for now." "Do I have a choice?" the boy asked, his voice unexpectedly steady despite his evident apprehension. James nodded. "Always. No one here will force you to stay where you don't wish to be." Something in this simple declaration seemed to reach the child. His shoulders relaxed slightly, though the wariness remained in his eyes. "Guess I could try it." For a while. That evening, as Daniel slept in what had once been intended as a nursery for children James and Mary Parker never had, Catherine and James sat on their porch beneath a sky ablaze with stars. "He reminds me of myself at that age," Catherine observed quietly, expecting the worst, braced for disappointment. James nodded, understanding. Life's taught him harsh lessons early. Takes time to unlearn those expectations. "Do you think he'll stay?" she asked, "beyond the temporary arrangement?" James considered this question with his characteristic thoughtfulness. "Depends on whether he finds what he needs here. Safety, certainly. But more than that, a sense of belonging." Catherine reached for his hand in the darkness, finding comfort in the strength and steadiness she had come to rely upon. "I never expected this life," she admitted. "When I left Boston, I thought I was choosing the practical path, not—" She gestured toward the house behind them, the sleeping child within, the connection between herself and the man beside her. "Not a family," James finished for her. "Yes," Catherine agreed softly. "A family formed not from obligation or convention, but from choice." James squeezed her hand gently. "Sometimes the strongest bonds are the ones we forge ourselves, rather than those we're born to." As they sat in companionable silence, watching the moon rise over distant mountains, Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From desperate escape to uncertain arrival, from rejection to acceptance, from temporary shelter to permanent home. Each step had seemed fraught with risk at the time, yet each had led her inexorably towards something she had scarcely dared to imagine: belonging. The path had not been what she expected when she boarded that eastbound train in Boston, but perhaps that was life's greatest wisdom, that our most meaningful destinations are rarely those we originally set out to reach. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, a wary boy to win over, a business to manage, a community to serve, a marriage to nurture. But tonight, sitting beside the man who had first offered refuge and now offered partnership, Catherine Miller Parker, felt something she had almost forgotten was possible. She felt at home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.